Hello, nerds. Thank you for tuning in to the High Fantasy Podcast. This is your co-host, Morgan, and today we're doing another author interview for you. And as you can see, I'm doing the intro bit in the flesh behind the camera. I just got a new tripod, and so Shalini and I are going to be doing much more video content and exciting stuff in the future for our YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that. So without any further ado, today's author is Miss Katie Cherry. Katie is the author of the Dragon Blood and Crystal Dragon fantasy series. She began writing at age 13 when her love of books outgrew the supply available. Fantasy stories, especially ones involving dragons, are her passion, and her work is enjoyed by readers of all ages. In late May of this year, Katie released a box set of the Crystal Dragon Saga, a coming-of-age adventure involving a planet full of mythical creatures and a strong heroine who is part human, part dragon. So this was a pretty fun author interview. Unfortunately, Katie wasn't feeling too well, and I think that day neither were Shalini and I. Again, with everything that's been going on with COVID-19, whenever we hear that someone isn't feeling too well or sick, that makes us also go, oh my God, hope that they're okay. I think Katie's great now, which is wonderful. Yeah, the part human, part dragon protagonist was like pretty unique. But I said that was she's the only author that I think has done that. However, we did interview way earlier in our series Mr. James Jenkins, who has Jack Bloodfist as his orc protagonist. So there are some non-human protagonists out there, but part dragon, I think Katie's is the first to be so. And just before we get into the interview, I just want to share one point that Katie made that was quite remarkable, and it was about what her purpose is behind being a writer and a fantasy novelist. And for her, that is to inspire young kids to learn to love to read and to get into writing and to just love literature. I just think that Katie really inspired us to revisit that aspect of this whole project. Like, what does it mean to be a writer, and especially in a fantasy genre? I just mentioned COVID-19, which no one really wants to hear, but fantasy novels for me in the past have greatly helped me get through tough times, and I think that that's really what they can serve as right now, as a model for us as a society to move past this really troublesome and like scary time and unstable time for a lot of us. So anywho, this was a really fun one, and I hope you folks will enjoy. Ciao. So interestingly enough, I think this is one of our first authors who has a protagonist that is a humanoid character, but is not fully human or fully elf or half elf.
Right.
This is outside of that traditional focus. So right away, Katie, very interested to talk to you about those choices. And thank you again for coming on. And can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and the Crystal Dragon series?
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to talk about my books. I don't have much to talk about myself. I'm kind of boring outside of my writing life. I play like video games. But yeah, my life has been like centered around books from an early age, just devouring them, reading them, and now I'm, creating them. So at the moment, that's kind of just my life is books.
We're both pretty big gamers, Shalini and I. What are your favorite games, Katie?
Well, my husband and I like to play first-person shooters. So, like, we've been playing Destiny, and then recently we've gotten into Apex Legends.
Okay, yeah, nice.
Very cool. Yeah, I have been played. I usually don't play first-person shooter, but more like MMORPGs, like Warcraft, and is Skyrim considered
a single-player one? But yeah,
right.
Yeah, fantasy RPG.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about the Crystal Dragon series and the box set that you've released recently?
Of course. So the box set is the first 3 books. There's going to be 7 books.
Wow.
Each one centered in a different realm. One of them is ours, and then the other 6 I just made up. So, oh man, there's a lot I can talk about the series. You did already point out that my main character is this female that is not completely human. And I find it interesting that you haven't seen that before. So that's fun. I get to be a first for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, maybe half elf at most. So something that is so similar to human, or basically an idealized version of a human being,
Yeah.
not something that would be considered other or like another species even.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like considered a whole other part of like
Yeah.
the mythical like lexicon where it's not exactly human.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, first she started out thinking that she was totally human. She grew up where we are in our world, which I call Second Earth. And then she gets taken to a realm called Zophiria, where she finds out that magic isn't fantasy, it's real. And she's their lost princess, and she's part dragon because she's part of the royal line. And generations back, they were a human and a dragon fell in love, essentially, and then he used magic to kind of like turn into a human, but then the dragon magic stayed in the bloodline. So she's the first one that has actually completely half and half human and dragon. So she's their prophesied dragon girl that's going to save them.
Interesting. And does that fact kind of come back to haunt them, or is it something that ends up being like a positive trait? Does she experience inner conflict because she figures out that she's basically of two different races?
Well, it's hard for her in the first book because, you know, she went from not believing in magic at all to being told that she's half dragon, which shouldn't exist in the first place. But when she embraces that side of herself, she kind of like falls in love with it. It does kind of get taken away from her, that part of herself, and so she kind of, you know, fully accepts it at that point and wants it back. And then that's one of the things that she chases through the series, is getting that part of herself back. The other part is finding one of her brothers. She was one of triplets. One of them was kidnapped by the bad guy and raised with him to be a bad guy, and then the other one was lost in the realms just like she was, but he hasn't been found yet. So she and her friend Nathan go through the realms and try to find him, and then she's also trying to get her powers back.
I feel like a lot of this kind of genre centers in like on the same planet. So Earth is like the first world, and then there's like a hidden realm within Earth where there's like a secret organization, or like in Harry Potter, there's the wizarding world. In Shadowhunters, there's the Shadowhunter world and the Down world, etc. That's separate from the world that we know, but it's still on the same planet. And it's interesting that you said that our Earth second Earth, and Zephyria is considered the first Earth. So what made you decide to make that spatial barrier, I guess, between the different planets? Is that because it almost seems like a sci-fi in that way? So yeah, just go with your thought process on that and take us on that journey.
Okay. Well, I don't think of them as planets per se, like in sci-fi. They're more pieces of our same world. We used to be all together, like Pangea, and then it broke apart into continents. That's kind of what happened with the realms, is there was one central realm, and then they broke apart into 7. And so there's Second Earth, which is us. There's Zephyria, which is the central one. Every realm connects through that one. And then there's First Earth, which is kind of where the sci-fi plays in, because there is more technologically advanced stuff there. So that's kind of where I dip into sci-fi. But the rest of them are like just like straight up fantasy. There's Quagon, Panorama, Lee, Zelon. I think that's all of them.
Well, and they each have. Oh, sorry. Oh, I was gonna say they each have like a different biodome. Like one is a desert and one is an underwater world. So they kind of experience those different realms and challenges as well as they go through.
Yes, so that's kind of how it worked out, is that they're different biomes. So it's kind of similar to going like around on one planet, but they're different realms and you have to travel to them by magic. So
yeah, so basically, like cosmologically, like all of these different realms are originally from the same thing, the same source. They're not actually distinct planets like we would think of within our solar system, kind of thing.
Right.
So we're interested in asking you what sparked your interest in dragons, and did that kind of come first with Crystal Dragon? Like you've written about dragons before with Dragon Blood. but how do dragons intersect in this multi-realm world, and what inspired you to write a female coming-of-age story that involves dragons? So I guess there's several parts to this question, but you can go whichever way you want.
Well, I've kind of been interested in dragons like forever. I don't even know when it began, but I guess just because I read a lot of fantasy, dragons were a central theme in most of them. And so I kind of just, I don't know, fell in love with them there, probably mostly in the inheritance cycle. That was one of my first favorites, because I can never have just one favorite, but it was my first one that I decided to claim as my favorite, was that series. So I kind of incorporate that into kind of everything that I write now at the moment is dragons. I forgot all of your other questions, but
what
it was pretty layered.
Yeah. I was curious to ask what inspired you to write a female coming of age story that involved dragons. Was it just kind of a flip side to inheritance cycle, or
well, when I started it, I was going into high school, so I just wanted a character my age. I kind of, the thing with reading with me is it feels like I'm there. So when I wrote, I was like, I want to, put myself in this too. So I basically built her around myself, and then was like, what would happen if I was taken to a magical realm? And then just kind of went from there. And dragons are kind of my thing, so that's why they're dragon.
Right. Can you tell us more about what you liked about the inheritance cycle? Because that's also one of my favorites growing up, and I've also been a writer from a young age, and Christopher Paolini, starting from a very young age himself, that was like really inspiring to watch him like become a bestseller at such a young age. So could you like tell us a bit more about what you like about that series?
Well, I honestly didn't realize that he started at a young age. I don't know. I never thought about age when I was writing. I was just like, I'm out of books. Let's write. The end. But what I loved about Eragon was just, I don't know, it was super dragon centered, and there was magic and a lot of character growth. I'm big on characters more than anything in the books that I read, because you can describe the world all day long and I'll be bored, but characters are something that people can connect to. So I was always very character centered, and Aragon was a really good character to connect with, as he went through his adventures, and went through all those horrible things, like when Brom died, and et cetera, et cetera. But
yeah,
it just captured me for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's very true. Because Morgan, you haven't read Eragon yet, and I've kept egging him to read it because I know that he'll love it. He also loves Star Wars, which a lot of people have drawn comparisons between Eragon and Star Wars, and just that it's young boy who discovers his powers, and there's a father figure, and blah blah blah. But you're right. Like I didn't really realize before how character-centered as well as dragon-centered Eragon is. And even though it's a quite expansive world, it does focus a lot on how people change and how war changes people, and how powers can change people and bring out, the good sides of them and less good sides of them as well. So that's pretty interesting, actually, to consider that. Is also the character driven aspect of your work. Does that also relate to the other genre that you kind of write in as well, which is romance with the fantasy element?
Well, the Crystal Dragon books don't really have any romance whatsoever, except for, what would naturally come from just them being teenagers.
Yeah.
But the Dragon Blood does have a little bit, again, mostly just because it's young adult and therefore it happens. They're not romance centered at all. They're just more fantasy centered. So the romance just happens because it happens whenever there's people.
And when characters develop together and all that good stuff.
Right. Like it will just naturally happen. And so it naturally happens in my books as well.
Mm-hmm. So I did have a question about fantasy and romance, but I think I'll just change it to what do you think is, and this is something we ask from quite a lot of authors, what do you think is the primary allure of fantasy to such a huge readership around the world. What do you think draws people in about fantasy? And does it have a role in society or in pop culture? What are your thoughts on
I haven't really thought about this before.
that?
I'd say fantasy has a big draw because it's similar enough to our world that like there's no really suspension of disbelief needed to step into it. It feels like our world, but better.
Mhm.
I think a lot of us just love magic and the feeling of, I don't know, freedom that it gives. So fantasy kind of combines freedom and idealism with realism of our world. So, everybody wants to have a better life, right? More exciting, more easy sometimes. Magic will do that too. So if I was to say that, then yeah, that's my answer, I guess.
Yeah. And yeah, we know that this like that's a pretty broad and heavy question. Every author gives us a different answer, but I think you gave a really concise distillation of things that we've talked about quite a bit, like how you put it, Katie, which is there's idealism with realism,
Yeah.
and like there's always like that part where I guess the reader is maybe subconsciously hoping or wanting a better life for themselves in some way.
Or seeking more, or an escapism that's
Yeah.
actually rooted in their real life.
Yeah, exactly. Or they want just adventure in real life again. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of themes do you think you're tapping into with Crystal Dragon? Like, of course, there's the coming of age aspect and kind of embracing who you are as a person when you find out like your background and your backstory. What other themes are you thinking about writing Crystal Dragon?
Well, Crystal does also encounter like mental hardships, emotional hardships, where she has some depression and anxiety. And I don't bring it up like immediately in the series. I bring it up about halfway through, but there are clues throughout the first few books that she does struggle with those things. So I like to show that even though she does have those struggles, she's still able to accomplish things, even though she does also have times when she breaks down and it's hard and she can't do it. She does always pick herself back up again and keeps going. So that's one thing I like to explore, is that even though it's hard, you can do it. Another one is she is very young in this series. She's a teenager all throughout. She does grow up through the series because it takes place over a few years. But book one, she's just 16, and she finds out she has to save Zolfaria from these dragon hunters. And then throughout the rest of the series, she finds out she needs to save all 7 realms from this guy Draven that wants to destroy them all. So as her trials get bigger, she's able to rise to the challenge, even though in the beginning she didn't think that she could do any of that and even smaller things. So we're also able to accomplish more than we think we can, especially with the people around us, because she does gather a lot of support as well. And she would not be able to do nearly what she's able to if she didn't have the support around her.
And a very pertinent kind of message, especially like during this time.
Yeah. I love that you also write about mental health issues and kind of weave that into your story, but it's not really overt at the beginning. I like that people can just try and pick up who she is and see where she goes and just kind of like get those clues as the story goes along. And that can also help with people identifying with the character a bit more, and definitely like speaks to the realism versus the idealism of fantasy as well, to have those characters that more realistic, but when you set them in an idealistic world, like what happens? Or even not so idealistic, it's the same sort of things that are happening here. Like, I think part of fantasy is that idea of the underdog coming into realizing that they can do more than they actually thought they could. And going against like insurmountable odds, which, in the world today seems very pertinent.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so Katie, tell us about your process of writing and becoming an independent author, and what were some of the things that you were surprised by during this process?
Trying to decide which one to start with, the writing or the author career. I guess I'll start with the writing since that did come first. The writing was interesting. It has evolved over the years. first I just, had that idea of I want to be in a fantasy world, and so I wrote myself into a fantasy world. And then the story just kind of took a life of its own, and the characters told me what was up, essentially, and then I just wrote it down. And while that does still happen, there's so much lore about the series now, and like all these details and like all these arcs that I need to keep track of that I kind of outline. I outlined almost too hard on the last book, I think, and it kind of cramped my creativity a little bit. So this one I'm just writing down like a bulleted things that I need to remember, and then just kind of winging it, which is nice for creativity, but it's rough for writing quickly. So I guess it's kind of a toss up there, which did surprise me that just neither way is great. It's hard no matter what, even after 9 years.
Yeah, you just have to find the right balance for yourself.
Yeah, it's true. There's not one way. And like Shalini and I were both the aspiring authors as well. And I've been experimenting a ton with different techniques, and I'm kind of just going with what feels easiest. And it is for everybody to some degree a mix between the gardener and then the architect. And that's kind of a thing that we like to visit.
Yeah. How did you decide to become an independent author, and what has that process been like for you?
Well, first I just was like so excited that I finished a book, and then I finished 2 books, and I wanted to share them. So I kind of just looked up how to just do it myself, and I stumbled upon CreateSpace, and so I made myself some print books, and then I kind of sold them to friends and family, and that was pretty much that. But it started the idea of like I could be an author, like I wrote a story and people were buying it. So then I started looking into like actually publishing, and Amazon makes it really easy, thankfully.
Yeah.
Just get to a KDP and upload my manuscript, and then ta-da, I'm published. But everything after that is much harder, for sure. I realized that I need to have a professional cover, I need to have editing, I need to learn how to write a blurb, I need to market, all that stuff. So it's a lot more complicated than I expected it to be. I was kind of one of those that like you just throw it up on Amazon and then it sells, or it. So so I've discovered there's a lot more to it than that, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think most authors, when they start, they're just like, oh, I'm good at writing, so let me be an author. And then you realize you also have to be, your own marketer, your own, like,
you have
to do all these businessman.
Like you have to sell your own brand kind of thing. You have to be savvy, and so much of it appears to have shifted to the internet. Even just like most of the literary industry and subculture, if you will, is online, like with ebooks, and everything is shifted to that medium.
Yeah. Katie, I've looked at your reviews and things like that, and people seem to love your books, and they always have some really great things to say about your work, it must be such a nice thing to see as well.
Definitely. I don't have a huge readership yet, but those that I have are pretty dedicated, and it just is amazing. And that's why I'm able to keep writing now, even when it gets hard, is because I have such amazing fans. And I don't need a ton. I just need a couple people to go, I want the next book and this is amazing. And so I often go back and read those like handful of reviews and just, remind myself that, like, to combat imposter syndrome especially, I'm an author and it's fine, and people like my books. They're not crap. So
yeah, it's definitely good to have that reminder every now and then when you're going through troubles. Going back to your writing style, Katie, what part of writing immerses you the most? Is it the world building aspect? Is it writing and developing those characters, which you seem pretty focused on?
Well, my brain works a little bit funny, and it's not very, like, a lot of people can picture very clearly what's in their head, but mine doesn't do that very much. So I have to just pick a couple of like aspects and then just remember those. Like if a bad guy has a scar on his right eye, like I just pick a couple of details about a character and then just kind of go with that. I wish I could draw, because that I think would help definitely with being able to picture my characters better. But it's also nice because then I don't over describe the characters and people can picture them however they want, more or less. I just give like color of eyes, color of hair, if they're tall or not, like habits like running their hands through their hair or picking at their clothes or whatnot, just these little distinctive things about each character. So I give them that so that they can be distinguished. And then everything else is kind of, the reader gets to kind of build the character themselves, which I hear is the way to do it anyway, just to do a couple of details and then move on. So I do that. And your original question, Shalini, is yes, it's very character focused. My writing, my world building is a little bit hard for me to do. Luckily, my husband is like in love with world building, so he helps me with that. But yeah, I'm kind of just very character centered myself.
I like to draw maps, and that's one of my biggest parts of world building. Is that something that you're also into?
Again, I can't picture it very well, but I wish I could. So I wish somebody could just like give me a map of my world and then I can go with that. That would be super helpful. But unfortunately, I also have to build the map. So
yeah, so if anyone's listening who's interested in maps and is a fan of Katie, then
Yeah.
oh, definitely. Yeah. Drop it and send it.
So we have one more like quite heavy question. I don't know if Morgan has any questions that are like
how can I distill it? What is it that you hope to achieve through writing and through writing fantasy? So in addition to like pleasing people, are you also trying to communicate your thoughts and ideas about things in society? Like, do you have kind of an end point or like a peak goal in your career that you're hoping comes to light someday?
That there's so many ways I can answer this. Because there's a lot of reasons that I write, but I think one of my biggest goals, especially when I started with my writing to accomplish with my books, was to help young like kids like learn to love to read, because it just broke my heart every time in school when somebody said they hated to read, and I was like, how can you hate to read? So I just love to help young readers learn that reading is awesome. And thankfully, I actually have had that happen a couple of times. I've had a couple of like 10-year-olds say that my book threw them forward into loving to read. And so I feel like I've peaked. But also, there's more things I can accomplish from here, and touching more youth with my books. But just installing that love to read, I think, blesses them through their lives. So that's kind of my happy spot, my hopes with my books.
It's so cool to hear that. You sound like it's a very humble kind of calling for you as well, and you really do love the fact that like you can inspire other people to read and to immerse themselves as well into fantasy and to truly enjoy it for what it is.
And it's great as a young author too to keep inspiring other young
That's
readers
true.
as well to see a young writer writing, because that's kind of what inspired me too. So it's cool that you can help people, especially youth, to realize a love for reading and perhaps writing someday. And as well as being a young writer, you have a lot of time ahead of you to develop your goals and see how much impact you can create. So that's really awesome.
Yeah, definitely.
Katie, what do you have in the works for the near future?
Well, at the moment, I'm finishing the Crystal Dragon series. I'm working on book 6 right now, and then there's book 7, and that will finally be done. And then after that, I do have a short story that I wrote that I want to expand on. It has Greek gods and magic and even a little bit more romance than my Dragonblood trilogy has. It's probably just going to be a duology, but I'm going to expand the one that I have currently as a short story called Blessed with a Curse, where she feels that she is cursed with magic because Zeus decided anybody with magic is a threat to him, and so they need to be reported and killed. So she's like, this is a curse, I'm going to die. And she also finds this demigod that's trapped in a statue because his dad the god of war, trapped him in there because he wasn't all about the war. He was like a peace hippie, and he was like, I'm not having any of that. So he trapped him in there, and so he felt cursed. But it turns out it was a blessing because they're able to meet each other, and then, but they have to take on the gods in order to, do what they want to with their lives. So that's my next project. It's been very fun already with just 10,000 words of a short story. So I'm excited to expand on that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Greek gods are always fun to write about. Fickle personalities and for character building.
Yeah.
It's great too.
I do really like stories where they take elements of Greco-Roman mythology, and that's pretty cool. And so with that, Ms. Katie Cherry, thank you for coming on to the High Fantasy Podcast. Do let us know where your fans can find your books and follow you on social media.
Yeah, will do. I'm on Facebook mostly. And I also have my newsletter. Those are the two big places to find me and chat with me and follow like new releases and stuff. I have a Facebook page, Katie Cherry's Fantasy Works, Facebook group, Katie Cherry's Bookworms, with a Y, like dragons.
Smart.
Okay. Yep, and then people can also follow and or friend my just personal profile.
Perfect. We'll have that all in the description bar as well.
And best of luck with your works in the meantime.
Yes, and stay healthy and safe.
Of course. Thank you very much. It's been great to be on.
Be great.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Check out the description of this video and you can see the different platforms we put our content on, as well as our social media links. Thanks again and see you next time.